In Tragedy, a true crime podcast, we discuss crimes that may be violent in nature. At times, we may cover homicides, missing people, and other topics that may be unsettling. Listener discretion is advised. In this chilling episode of Tragedy, a true crime podcast, we unravel the dark legacy of James Hicks, one of Maine's most notorious serial killers. Hicks's story stretches over 2 decades, beginning in 1977 with the disappearance of his young wife, Jenny Sear. It would take years, a groundbreaking no-body trial, a manslaughter conviction, before authorities realized the full scope of his crimes. From Jenny's vanishing in Penobscot County to the abduction of Jerry Lynn Towers outside a Newport bar, and finally the disappearance of Lynn Willette in Brewer, Maine nearly 20 years later, Hicks left a trail of fear and unanswered questions. Despite prison time and law enforcement suspicion, he managed to slip through the cracks until a violent assault near Lubbock, Texas in 2000 finally forced his secrets into the open. Through court records, survivor accounts, and chilling police interviews, this episode explores how Hicks manipulated those around him, how investigators slowly pieced together his pattern, and how systemic failures allowed him to remain free for so long. We also consider the long-lasting impact of the victims' families and the Maine communities that lived in the shadow of his crimes. Join us as we examine the psychology of control, the failures of early investigations, and the moment Hicks confessed to not just 1, but 3 brutal murders. Welcome to Tragedy, a true crime podcast. I'm Elisa.
And I'm Michael.
And tonight we're heading deep into the woods of Maine to explore the crimes of James Hicks.
Yeah, we decided to do this because we thought it might be interesting in some of our travels to take a look at some of the cases that may be involved in the states that we visit.
And James Hicks is a man whose trail of violence spanned more than 2 decades. And his story begins with the disappearance of his first wife, who's very young, and ends with a confession that shocked the states of both Texas and Maine.
Wow.
So let's get into it.
I like it.
Yeah. So to understand how James Hicks evaded justice for so long, we first need to step back into Maine in the late 1970s.
Okay, this goes back a little while then.
Correct. So in the late 70s, the economy was kind of struggling in Maine. Unemployment rates were higher than the national average, and in a lot of the rural areas, families were really feeling that pinch. But then as time went by and we got into the 90s, things have really shifted. So Maine became really popular for tourism. The seafood industry boomed. And as forestry became more sustainable, it became a major economic leverage point for the state of Maine. And interestingly enough, I noticed when we were in Maine that vacation land was written on a lot of the state license plates. So I actually looked it up, and in 1936, vacation land became the official motto of Maine, which I think is really interesting because, in the late 70s, things weren't going really well, but I guess they stuck with vacation land because then eventually things turned around.
Well, I would say vacation land as long as you stay away from this place in the winter.
That's true. That's not my kind of vacation. Might be somebody else's. And it is called vacation land because of its unique natural beauty. There are forests, coastlines, mountains. This is one of those places where you can see the ocean and the bay, and then you turn around behind you and you see mountains and trees and forests. But behind the postcard beauty of pine forests and coastal villages, Maine carried a darker undercurrent. Between 1977 and 1996, 3 women would vanish within an 80-mile stretch of each other, and they were all tied to one man, James Hicks. So let's start with his first victim, his wife, Jenny.
Well, before we get into it, I kind of wish we had our geographic profiler taking a look at this, because when you talk about this 80-mile range, that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. From my understanding, this is before geoprofiling was really a thing.
Well, and it's really interesting that you bring this up because this has come up in other serial killers who travel interstates and they kill along their routes. You bring up a good point. I think in this particular case, we're talking about a guy who didn't really have a lot of money. And so he really was localized to one area. And that's kind of why this sort of happened with him. So Jenny Sear was just 16 when she married James Hicks. And they quickly had children, but their relationship was really rocky from the beginning. And in 1974, someone filed for divorce, but shortly after that, she discovered that she was pregnant again. So they continued their relationship. And about 3 years later, she's 23 years old and she's living in Carmel, Maine, and she's really trying to establish financial freedom for herself. So they're still married. Okay. But, as we talked about earlier, the economy wasn't really great in the late 70s in Maine. And so he had to travel quite far for his daily work. And so she was kind of on her own a lot.
So wait a second. He drove 6 to 7 hours every day?
Yeah, that's what the research looks like. There are, 3 main sources that I used when I was doing the research for this case. And of course, this is the late 70s, right? So who knows how accurate that is. So he wasn't living and working in the same town. And so she decided to start taking some classes. And so she was taking some nursing aid classes, and she was working at a local nursing home. Now, this is July of 1977. Right. She's starting to try to establish herself. Now, on the evening of July 19th, 1977, James Hicks, he calls police to report that Jenny is missing. And he tells her, quote, she ran off with a trucker. And her family never believed this. And she's 23, she's young, she's got 2 kids. She's trying to establish some financial freedom. They've obviously had a lot of marital concerns along the way. And now he's reporting her missing and saying that she ran off with the trucker.
Well, it's kind of a big leap here. So when you said they had marital concerns, were the concerns originally with her or with him or both? And kind of, how do we get from marital concerns to she's run off with a trucker? Like, what is there kind of a history here?
There really wasn't one, and there wasn't really a record of establishing anything because, back then we're not really keeping records as much as we do now.
Right, true.
But the family was very clear that they never thought that that's what happened, and they knew that they had been struggling with their relationship. Keep in mind, she's 16 when they met and married.
Okay.
Right. So, so the police start investigating this, right? Because he's called her in and he's saying she's missing. So during this investigation in 1977, the police end up speaking with a foster child who lived in the household. She was a teenager, and a neighbor. And both of these people describe something a lot more disturbing than the potential of her running off with a trucker. In fact, they report to police that they are afraid of him.
Did they indicate why they were afraid of him?
Yeah. So the neighbor, she recalled hearing violent fighting from the trailer in the early morning hours that Jenny vanished. And the foster child, obviously, she's there. So she's reporting several instances of physical abuse, and he's yelling at them all of the time. And so these accounts from the foster child and the neighbor are actually enough to have enough evidence for charges to be filed against Hicks for the murder of Jenny. Now, we have no body. There's no weapon. She's essentially disappeared, but they have enough circumstantial evidence from what these 2 people are saying that they have enough to file charges.
Okay.
Yep. And this case, this 1977 case, becomes Maine's very first no-body homicide. So for those of us who follow true crime, we know that it can be very difficult to even file charges, let alone convict someone of a violent crime, murder, when there's no body, and they don't have a body. But despite that body never being found, the circumstantial evidence, the testimony from the foster child and the neighbor, he's arrested for murder, but he ends up with a manslaughter conviction.
And it's because of the lack of a body.
Yeah, it was called Murder 4. Now, this is in 1984. Okay, so I want to establish this timeline. They get married in the early 70s. She disappears in 1977, and it's not until 1984 that he's convicted of manslaughter for her death. So
Okay.
there's this kind of block of time. This becomes very important as we take a look at his second victim. And so he's convicted in 1984 for 10 years. That's it. 10 years for murder 4, manslaughter,
Okay.
and he serves 7.
So he served 7 years for murdering his wife.
Yes. Exactly.
All right.
Right? All right. Now, this time frame, really, really important. Now, we need to kind of go back in time into the middle of this time range from 1977 to 1984. Now, remember, she disappears in 1977. He doesn't get convicted until 1984. Okay. Now, in October of 1982, so 2 years before he's convicted of murdering Jenny, and actually 5 years after she vanishes, he meets 34-year-old Geraldine Towers at a bar. It's called the Gateway Lounge. Apparently it's not there anymore, in Newport, Maine. So Geraldine Towers has gone out for a casual night with family and friends. And then on her way home, she stops at the Gateway Lounge for a drink. Now, witnesses report that they saw her with James Hicks. They had a few drinks together. They laughed. According to the bartender, they left together. And then the next morning, Geraldine doesn't return home, and her family files, guess what?
A missing persons report.
A missing persons report. She's missing. Well, the bartender has seen them together. And so when the police start doing their investigation and they're backtracking, where has Geraldine been? They go to the Gateway Lounge where she had been drinking, and the bartender says, "Oh yeah, I saw her with James Hicks." And so he gets questioned, and he says, "Sure, yeah, he'd been hanging out with Geraldine, right? He'd been at the bar drinking with her, but he didn't leave with her." So he denies what the bartender says she has seen. Shortly after this, the bartender begins receiving threatening phone calls. And she's pretty sure they're from him, right? They're intimidating phone calls, controlling type phone calls. He's kind of freaking her out, but she can't prove that it's him. But during this time, Jim Riker, so he's the local police officer in Newport, Maine, he starts digging around into Hicks's past, because we know that he's the last person who was seen with this missing girl. And Jim Riker discovers something very alarming, that his first wife, Jenny, is missing. Jim Riker is one of the first people to connect the disappearance of these 2 women to James Hicks. So this is in 1982. So now 2 women in his close circle have disappeared, but this is before he is convicted of the murder of his first wife. So what it's looking like is he may have disappeared 2 women, one during that interim time, and then the one he was convicted of.
What is the likelihood that, I guess when I'm listening to you tell this story, we had a lot of time that went by when his first victim was missing. Again, we have the no body thing, but we're not to that conviction yet. This is 2 years prior to that conviction. Did having 2 people in such close proximity to him initiate furthering that investigation for the first one?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it may have had something to do with what happened with the first one. Again, it's all like hearsay, right? It's the bartender saw him with this girl who disappeared. They did, unlike his wife, Geraldine Towers and James Hicks did not have a pre-existing relationship.
Okay.
They weren't dating. They just happened to meet each other at the Gateway Lounge. And so Riker is continuing to try to find out what's going on with Geraldine Towers. But again, we have no body, no evidence, and that case went cold. And then 2 years later, Hicks gets arrested for the murder of his first wife, Jenny, and serves time. Okay, so now we can kind of go more in a sequential timeline. So he gets released from prison for the murder of his first wife, Jenny Sear, in 1990. And remember, at this time, he's been convicted and he served time for his first wife. And then the case went cold on the lady in the bar that disappeared. But we're going to come back to her. So here in Brewer, Maine in 1990, he meets Lynette Willett. And they begin dating. And of course, she doesn't know anything about him, right? It's the 90s. You can't just, Google somebody up and find out their past. She has no idea what he has done. Of course, he's not going to tell her.
So she has no idea that he's been in prison at this point.
No, okay. Nothing. And by spring of 1996, they have this relationship for quite a while. And in spring of 1996, she's decided she's had it with him. It's obviously, we know that this guy has a pattern of not treating women well, right? And she's figuring out that this is kind of his pattern and she's not here for it. So she tells her friends that she's going to move out. She's doing this real quietly. Obviously, he is an abuser, and we know that it can be challenging for people who are in abusive situations to be able to just leave. So she's doing this very quietly. She's telling her friends. She's slowly moving her things back to her mom's house, and she's getting ready to break off their relationship.
So he doesn't know this is happening.
It doesn't seem to be that is the case. Yeah. Something that's really interesting is that, and I couldn't really pinpoint exactly what was happening, but there's this officer named Joe Zamboni. It's actually his name.
Okay.
That's a good name for Maine, right?
That is a good name for Maine.
He's was working for the Maine State Police. Now, this particular person knew that Hicks had a violent history. And for some reason, Hicks was called into the police station for something. Again, I couldn't really find out because a lot of the stuff was happening before we had a good record of things like that. But he takes Lynette with him to the police station for whatever it is that he's getting called into the police station for. And this Joe Zamboni, who knows of Hicks's past, is quietly trying to drop hints to Lynette because they're sitting there together.
Why did she think she was there?
I don't know. I mean, if it's like most abusive relationships, he doesn't leave her alone. So
yeah, it just seems strange to me that he took her. She doesn't know his past.
Yeah.
And he didn't seem to be concerned that maybe his past would come up during any kind of questioning. I would have been concerned about that.
Well, I think when you are a person who has a history of controlling people, this isn't something you're concerned about. Because you
just explain it away.
You brainwash people and they're going to believe you. Yeah. So this officer, Zamboni, he's trying to drop these hints to Lynette while she's sitting at the police station, and she's just, it doesn't come through for her. So it doesn't end up having the impact that he was hoping it would happen. And so soon after this visit at the police station, Hicks calls the police to report, guess what?
Missing person?
Yes, Lynette, the current girlfriend, she's missing.
That was quick.
Wow. Yeah. So he files a report himself even before her family knew that anything was going on.
He's learned his lesson from the first one.
It's a little fishy, right? So her family starts to realize that something is going on because she doesn't show up at this family barbecue. And so the family, they're trying to find her. Where is she? And then that's when they find out that the missing person's case had been filed. And so at this point, we have several parallels to Jenny's case. Now, remember, we've got Geraldine, but nobody knows about her right now at all.
Her, yeah.
He did that before he even went to prison. But we definitely knew about Jenny's disappearance and suspected murder because he'd served time for that. But we've got two women who were involved with him romantically, who have now disappeared with no body, no murder weapon, nothing, right? So Officer Zamboni is trying to figure out what's going on with Lynette. Where is she? But there's really nothing he can figure out. And of course, James Hicks is pretty good at not saying things, right? And
manipulation.
Yes. And so the case goes cold again. Now, we're going to fast forward until 2000, and this is where things really, really changed. And this all began with a brutal assault nearly 2,000 miles away outside of Lubbock, Texas. And this is where Hicks's secrets finally spill out into the open.
Mm-hmm.
So he's reported Lynette missing, right? She's, quote, disappeared. Well, guess what he does? Guess what he's going to do now?
I have no idea.
He meets an 18-year-old girl.
Oh, just move on to number 4.
And she gets pregnant. Yes, she gets pregnant. Yes.
Okay.
So we've got an 18-year-old girl. Her name is Brandy Mayo, and she gets pregnant. Now,
how many children are associated with this guy now?
This is a great question. I believe there are 2 with the first wife. And we have at least 2 with this 18-year-old girl now in 2000. Who knows how many others? There could be others that are still around that he had children with, but too many. Let's just say too many.
All right.
Yeah, we'll just go with that. But their first child was taken away by Department of Human Services. I couldn't really figure out why. I mean, it's not surprising. And we could probably go based on what we know from his previous relationships. An unstable family environment, probably physical abuse, yelling, all that kind of stuff.
It's not surprising.
No, not surprising at all. But she gets pregnant again.
All right.
A second time. And this time he convinces her she doesn't want her child taken away. So he convinces her to move out of Maine all the way to Texas. Under the guise of
I'm assuming they sold condoms in Maine, right?
I assume that they probably did. I mean, this is the 2000s.
It doesn't seem like that was happening.
That's right. So they moved to a small town outside of Lubbock, Texas. He tells her to avoid losing another child. So Lubbock, Texas is in the panhandle of Texas, so the northern part of Texas. And it is pretty remote. There's Amarillo. A lot of people know about Amarillo. It's on I-40. Lubbock is about an hour and a half, 45 minutes. But once you get outside of Lubbock, there's nothing. There's little towns. Great place to sort of disappear. Or so he tries. But he cannot help himself from continuing to assault women. And that's where he made his biggest mistake, is what happened in Lubbock. So they're living in Lubbock. He thinks that he's gotten away, with the things that he has done in Maine. And he's doing handyman work. So he's working for this woman named June Moss. Now, this is a little different. She is an older woman. So she's 67. And he's doing some handyman work at her home. And something went off the rails one day when he was working at her house, and he beat her up. He just physically assaulted her. He forced her to ingest some sort of toxic substance. And he fired a gun at her. So they're having this altercation in her home.
That's not an altercation. That's an attack.
Yes, you're right. He's attacking her in her home. She's, obviously lives by herself, and she's got this guy over doing some handyman work for her. And this is what happens. Now, shockingly enough, she escapes. She gets out. She's running out of her house. Of course, we've got the neighbors. Now, here's the thing. This is Texas, right? So people are paying attention to what's going on in their neighborhood, and the neighbor sees her. And he is identified, and he's arrested for this attack. Let me say it again. This is Texas. So this lady's not disappeared. She's an elderly woman. He shot at her. He beat her up. He made her drink some sort of toxic substance. And he goes to jail, awaiting charges. And he pretty much figures out that the Texas prison system is a little different from the Maine prison system that he had experienced when he was in jail.
Texas doesn't mess around. Same with Florida. I mean, that's obviously my state, and these are states that you don't mess around with. They both have the death penalty. If you're a serial murderer at this point, this is not this is not where you want to be.
Right. Keep in mind, nobody knows he's a serial murderer yet, right? He was convicted of the one crime and served his time, but this is before he's even gone to prison. Like, he realizes in jail while he's awaiting trial for this attack of this elderly woman, this isn't going to be a cakewalk.
Well, go Texas.
Right, in Texas. So he makes a deal, right? Obviously, the law enforcement in Texas is kind of looking up his record, and they realize, oh, this guy served time in Maine. Let's give Maine a call and let's figure out, what are we dealing with here? And so he makes this deal, James Hicks does. And the deal is, in exchange for avoiding a sentence in Texas, he's not even sentenced in Texas. That's how afraid he is of the prison system in Texas. He confesses to killing Lynette Willette. This is the third lady that he killed.
Holy crap. He was willing to confess to murder to get out of Texas.
Right.
I'm not sure what they told him, but that must have scared the crap out of him.
Yeah. And so during this, he's like, I'm going to make this deal. I'm going to tell you that I killed Lynette Willette. So, of course, the Maine law enforcement, they come out to Lubbock. They're interviewing him. He confesses to killing Lynette Willette. And then he just subsequently, pretty shortly right after that, in the same interview, confesses to killing Geraldine Towers. Just out of the blue. Like, this is how bad he wants to get out of Texas.
So he's confessed it. These have gone from missing people to murders.
That's right. So he says, yes, I killed Lynette Willette. Yes, I killed Geraldine Towers. And, oh, by the way, yes, I killed my first wife, too. So he confesses to all three murders.
All three.
As part of the deal.
Wow, he really wanted to get out of Texas.
Right. And so Maine law enforcement was like, okay, well, you need to take us to the bodies. We're not just going to take your word for it. So he does. They send him to Maine. He tells them where he buried all the bodies. He had the same, they were all buried in shallow graves, all three the same. He strangled all three of them. Mm-hmm. And he explains all of that. And he also, and this is one of those things we want to make sure that, listeners are acutely aware of who is around them. But he also dismembered all of their bodies before he buried them. Like, this is his way of trying to get away with it. Right. So then by November of 2000, so this happened pretty quickly because this attack in Lubbock was in 2000. And by the end of that year, he is sentenced to life in prison.
In Maine.
Yes. That was the deal.
Yeah.
I'll tell you everything I know. Well, I'll tell you about a person I killed, and then I can spend my life in prison in Maine and not in Texas. Oh, and by the way, I also killed these two other women. He just throws those in extra. So at this time, he is still incarcerated in the Maine State Prison, and he is 74 years old. So for the families of Jenny, Geraldine, and Lynette, Hicks's confession was both a relief and devastation, right? Because while Jenny, he went to prison for murdering her, there was never a body, right? And so sometimes families will hold out hope, right, that their loved ones are still around. But when he confesses to killing them and they find the bodies, then they know the truth. And it's been several years and years, like over 30 years for the first family.
Wow.
So, of course, these are smaller communities, and they're wondering, like, what red flags did we miss? Could he have been stopped earlier? Were there any missteps on part of law enforcement? And investigators, they did admit some mistakes, like Jenny, the first wife, her original missing persons report wasn't even filed properly. I think we've seen that with our other missing persons case. It wasn't that the missing persons case was filed improperly, but the request for cell phone records.
Right.
In 2024. Geraldine's case lost a lot of momentum despite the credible witness of the bartender because they couldn't put any connections together. And Lynette, she was planning on leaving. Like, she was getting ready to move out shortly before he killed her. So So criminologists later pointed out that Hicks fit the classic elements of a serial killer's profile. He had childhood instability, control through intimidation, and escalation in violence. But this isn't just a profile in evil. It's also the story about the systemic failures and when law enforcement misses early opportunities, and the cost that can be made down the road from there. So James Hicks will likely die behind bars, right? He's something. But his crimes left permanent scars across 3 families in the state of Maine. And of course, the woman in Texas who was attacked. His case reminds us how important it is to listen to survivors and take missing persons seriously and never dismiss the patterns of violence that are hiding in plain sight. So there were 3 main sources that I really focused on when I was researching this case. The first is actually a book. There's a book written by Trudy Ski about James Hicks. It's called Tragedy in the North Woods, The Murders of James Hicks. There's also a podcast called Murder, She Told. And there's a YouTube channel called Misery Machine, and they did a 2-part series on James Hicks. And that one's kind of interesting because the folks who do the Misery Machine are actually from Maine. And so they were able to kind of help picture.
Yeah, they provided a lot of interesting information about certain towns, how remote things were, as well as just the terrain.
Yeah. So we hope you enjoyed this episode of Tragedy, a true crime podcast. It's been a little different. But if you found this story important, please share our show, leave a review, and keep following us to keep up with our previous cases. If you're new, if this is the first episode that you've ever listened to, you might want to go back because we have a 7-part series on another cold case, right? The unsolved homicide of your uncle, right? Jody Kilgore. Out of North Florida, and then a more current case, a missing persons case of Ian Rogers, also out of North Florida. So if you have not listened to our podcast before, as we said, this is a little different from what we normally do, but we would love for you to go back and listen to our other cases where we have several episodes about each of those. Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Tragedy, a True Crime Podcast. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like, follow, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Your support helps us continue sharing these cases and keeps the memories of victims alive. And if you'd like to go a step further, leaving a review or sharing the show with a friend makes a huge impact. Lastly, if you have a case for us to consider, you can email us at tragedy@truecrimepodcast@gmail.com.